The day of the will reading felt unreal, like I was watching my own life from behind a glass wall. The chairs were arranged in a stiff little circle, the kind you'd find in a doctor's waiting room, not a place where a man's entire legacy was about to be divided. I sat with my hands clasped tightly, the imprint of my wedding band digging into my palm. It grounded me in a way I desperately needed. Rebecca, my daughter-in-law, sat upright as if she were hosting a seminar. Her expression didn't show grief or tenderness or even polite discomfort. It showed possession, as though she were already rehearsing the lines she planned to deliver. And then she stood. She didn't look at me. She didn't even clear her throat. She simply rose, like she had been waiting for a cue only she could hear. "Before we begin," she said in that crisp courtroom-trained tone she loved to wield, "I want to clarify that certain distributions have been reassigned, effective immediately." The room stiffened. No one else spoke. The attorney's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he didn't interrupt her. He must have already seen what was coming. I hadn't. Rebecca continued, folding her hands neatly over the folder she brought. "Remaining personal and financial allocations tied to Patrick's estate will no longer include Marin." She didn't even say my name correctly. "All matters have been updated to reflect the most recent changes." I blinked at her, the words hitting my chest like cold water. I had cared for Patrick through every breath of his decline, wiping his forehead, holding his hand during his worst nights, sleeping upright in a chair for weeks at a time. And now his own daughter-in-law was announcing, without ceremony or warmth, that I had been erased from the life I had helped build for nearly half a century. I tried to process it, but shock has a way of muting the body. I felt heavy, rooted to the chair, unable to move or breathe properly. The attorney inhaled sharply, then, to my bewilderment, let out a dry laugh. Not mocking, not amused, more like someone who'd been handed a puzzle piece that didn't fit the picture he'd been expecting. That laugh was the first crack in the certainty of the room. Rebecca's eyes flickered. Something wasn't aligning, something she hadn't expected. I didn't know what it meant, not yet, but it shifted something deep inside me, like the slow groan of a door finally beginning to open after months of being jammed shut. Later, after the reading ended, after the polite faces drifted away with murmured condolences and practiced frowns, I found myself alone in the garden behind the house. The last of the guests had left their plastic cups half filled on tables, and a breeze carried the scent of lilies and cut grass. But all I could think was, why had the lawyer laughed? And what did Patrick leave behind that Rebecca never intended me to find? Because that tiny laugh was the beginning of a truth someone had worked very hard to bury. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next chapter of this unfolding story. The house was too silent when I stepped back inside from the garden. Silence isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it presses against the walls, like a reminder of everything that's gone missing. The last guest had barely pulled out of the driveway when Rebecca began clearing the dining table with the efficiency of someone closing down a business at the end of a shift. I watched her from the doorway for a moment. She moved with purpose, gathering folders, stacking papers, checking her phone. No tremble, no hesitation, not even the residue of a daughter grieving her father's memory. I cleared my throat gently, a small attempt to signal I was still present in the room. She didn't look up. "We'll be starting the administrative processing next week. I've arranged everything with the firm." Not our firm. Not your wishes, just hers. She had always been ambitious, sharp-minded, quick with decisions, efficient to a fault. At first, I admired it. I used to tell Patrick she would climb far in her field. But ambition without empathy easily slips into something colder, something territorial. Patrick would have frowned at how she was speaking to me now. "Rebecca," I finally said softly, "is there anything I need to prepare?" She paused only long enough to pick up another stack of documents. "Nothing. All relevant matters were settled before." Before she finished, she reached into her briefcase and handed me a small square box. "He wanted you to have this." Her voice held no warmth, no softness, just mechanical courtesy. I opened the lid. Inside lay a simple silver tie clip, one I barely remember seeing Patrick wear. No note, no message, no explanation, just the bare metal resting in a foam slot. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. Patrick was a man of words. He wrote notes on napkins, letters on scrap paper, reminders tucked into books. There should have been something, anything. Even 2 sentences scribbled in his unsteady handwriting would have meant more than this hollow token. But Rebecca shut her bag with a decisive snap, dismissing the moment like she had checked off the final task on her list. And then she left, just walked away. That night, I sat in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug of cooling tea. The walls still carried traces of Patrick, his aftershave lingering in the hallway, the faint smell of his old notebooks, the creak in the floorboard he'd always promised to fix. Yet, somehow in the very home we built, I felt like a guest overstaying her welcome. It wasn't just grief. It was displacement, a quiet creeping feeling that I had been stepped around, edited out, and politely ushered aside. I kept telling myself maybe I was tired, maybe I was imagining the shift. But deep down, I knew better. Because people don't erase others by accident, not this thoroughly. And the next morning, the first sign arrived that Rebecca's perfect planning wasn't as seamless as she wanted everyone to believe. The email arrived early the next morning, so clinical and impersonal that I almost mistook it for spam. The subject line read simply, "Estate Administration Meeting, Attendance Required." No greeting, no gentle inquiry about how I was coping, not even a courtesy call from Rebecca herself. It had been sent by her assistant, a young woman I'd only met twice, both times for less than a minute. I stared at the message, reading the time and location twice to make sure I understood it correctly. Wednesday, 9 a.m., her firm's downtown office. The email's tone struck me more deeply than its content. Not the date, not the address, the implication. As if I were an outsider being summoned, as if Patrick's affairs had nothing to do with me. For the first time in days, I felt something sharper than confusion, an ember of indignation warming somewhere in my chest. Still, I went. On Wednesday morning, I drove slowly, stopping twice along the way because my hands trembled just a little on the steering wheel. Doubt whispered, maybe I shouldn't go. Maybe she wants me to feel out of place. But another voice, quieter, steadier, told me I had every right to be there. The building was tall and glassy, the kind designed to impress with its sterile perfection. The lobby smelled of eucalyptus, printer ink, and cool air. A receptionist barely glanced up as she directed me to the conference room. When I stepped inside, a wave of suited bodies turned briefly, then looked away again. There were 7 people arranged around a gleaming table, each with a folder or laptop. Rebecca sat at the head, poised like she'd been carved out of composure, her expression flat. She didn't greet me. She didn't offer a seat. She didn't even acknowledge my name. She simply nodded toward the only empty chair at the far end of the table, away from the documents, the coffee, the conversation. A chair placed deliberately, almost symbolically, like the lone open seat on a bus that someone hopes you won't dare to take. I sat anyway. Rebecca began speaking with the tone of a practice lecturer, brisk and unyielding. She outlined assets, accounts, properties, business holdings like she was reciting inventory from a storage facility. Every allocation went to someone else. Every mention of a beneficiary excluded me, as if my decades with Patrick had been reduced to a footnote that no one bothered to read. Then came the moment that sealed my suspicion. An associate asked, "And what about Mrs. Lowell's share?" Rebecca didn't flinch. There are no remaining distributions assigned to her under the final revision. No explanation, no apology, not even a glance in my direction. Just erasure disguised as professionalism. My heart didn't race, my hands didn't shake. Instead, I felt an unexpected steadiness, like my body had finally decided that shock was a luxury I could no longer afford. When the meeting ended, I waited. I lingered in the doorway until everyone had left, hoping Rebecca might say something, anything, to justify what she'd done. She didn't. She only packed her bag with mechanical precision and walked out as though this were an ordinary morning. Outside, the cold cut through my coat, but I barely felt it. I kept hearing one sentence echoing in my mind. There are no remaining distributions assigned to her. But that wasn't the end, because the universe has a way of delivering cracks in perfect facades. And that crack appeared the moment I opened Patrick's study drawer later that night and found something Rebecca never intended me to see. I didn't plan to open the drawer in Patrick's study that night. In fact, I walked into the room only because the silence felt too large, and I needed a place where his presence still lingered. His study had always been his sanctuary, books stacked in uneven towers, pencils tucked behind frames, the faint scent of pine oil from the old desk he refused to replace. The desk drawer squeaked when I pulled it open. It always had. Patrick used to joke that he'd fix it next weekend and then laugh when the next weekend never came. That familiar sound, shrill, stubborn, hit me with a pang so sharp I had to grip the edge of the desk. Inside lay the usual clutter: receipts from the local bookstore, a few dried-out pens, a mechanical pencil with teeth marks from when he used to think deeply without realizing he was chewing it. There were sticky notes with shopping reminders, a half-finished crossword tucked under an envelope. But at the back, half buried beneath a ledger, I saw a thin manila folder I didn't recognize. No label, no crease from frequent handling, just a quiet little secret lying flat against the wood. My pulse quickened as I slid it out. The folder felt heavier than its thickness suggested, almost reluctant to be opened. The first page inside was handwritten, Patrick's handwriting. It had grown shakier near the end, but the slant and rhythm were unmistakable. The note wasn't addressed to anyone. It read more like thoughts jotted down during a moment of unease. It read, "Rebecca insists I update the will. Says timeline is urgent. Says clarity is needed. I'm not certain. Something doesn't feel right. She's preparing documents ahead of my approval. Haven't mentioned this to Marin. She'd ask questions I'm not ready to answer. I read those sentences again and again. Each time the space between the lines grew colder. Patrick had been uncertain. He had felt pressured. He had sensed something was off, and he hadn't told me. The second page was a photocopy of a will draft, one I had never seen. Unlike the document at the meeting, this version had notes scribbled in the margins, circles around certain clauses, arrows linking one section to another. And then I saw it. My name. A line that read, "In the event of my passing, I leave personal assets and designated accounts to my wife, Marin Lowell." But it had been crossed out. In thick, deliberate strokes. Next to it, in the margin, someone had written, "Discuss with Rebecca." My throat tightened. The third page was a typed schedule, appointment dates, legal consultations, names of firms I didn't recognize. Several meetings had taken place during the weeks Patrick was too weak to walk without help. Meetings I hadn't known about. Meetings someone else had arranged. By the time I finished reading, my hands were trembling, not with fear, but with dawning clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't oversight. This was orchestration. I gathered the papers back into the folder and hid them beneath an old stack of magazines in the hallway closet, my mind racing too fast to rest. Someone had rewritten my place in Patrick's story. And it was no accident. But the true unraveling began the next morning when I made a phone call that would change everything. I barely slept that night. Every time I shut my eyes, I saw Patrick's handwriting. Those uneven letters, the lines crossed through my name, the uneasy note about Rebecca pressing him to clarify things. The house seemed to shift around me in the dark. Shadows stretched too long, floorboards murmured under my feet. It felt like Patrick was trying to speak from somewhere just beyond reach. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay silent. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at a mug of coffee I hadn't touched, and scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I hadn't spoken in years. Daniel Crow, an old friend of Patrick's, level-headed, fair, someone Patrick had trusted long before Rebecca came into the picture. I dialed before I could overthink. He answered on the second ring. "Marin?" His voice held surprise, but not the kind that made you feel like an inconvenience. "Is everything all right?" "No," I said, and the honesty of it nearly broke me. "I need your help." We agreed to meet the next morning at a small cafe off Elm Street, the one where Patrick and Daniel used to argue about baseball statistics over bitter coffee. When I arrived, Daniel was already there, coat draped over the booth beside him, a steaming mug between his hands. His hair had gone grayer, but his eyes were still the same. Steady, observant, kind. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I reached into my bag, pulled out the manila folder, and placed it on the cable between us. He read in silence. As his eyes traveled down the handwritten note, his jaw tightened. When he reached the second page, the draft will, the lines around his mouth deepened. He flipped back and forth between the documents, forming an invisible timeline in his mind. He tapped one page lightly with his finger. "This doesn't line up." "With what?" I asked. "With what Patrick told me," he said carefully. "We talked about the trust last fall. He said nothing was changing, that everything was staying exactly as it had been for years. He didn't mention Rebecca taking control, and he would have. Patrick didn't keep financial decisions from the people they affected." I swallowed hard. His confirmation felt like the floor steadying beneath me after weeks of free fall. Daniel pulled out a small notepad from his coat. He had always been the type to write things down instead of relying on memory. He began listing names, dates, firms Rebecca had referenced, items from the folder. Then he circled one detail that caught his attention. The witness signatures. "Do you know either of these names?" I didn't. And that alone made my pulse quicken. Daniel leaned back, thoughtful. Patrick always used people he trusted for legal witnessing. Friends, neighbors, people with history. He tapped the page. These aren't from his world. These are from hers. We spoke for nearly an hour. By the end, we had a quiet plan. He would request official documents, compare them to what I found, and verify every discrepancy, slowly, quietly, carefully. As I walked home, a cold wind swept through the street, tugging at my coat, but for the first time since Patrick died, I felt something stir in me. Not hope, not yet, but a fragile sense of direction. Rebecca had changed something. Patrick had sensed it. And now Daniel had seen it too. But the real shock came later that day, when Patrick's old calendar revealed a name I hadn't heard in years. When I returned home that evening, the house felt heavier than before, as if every photograph and piece of furniture carried new meaning. I moved through each room like I was walking through a museum of my own life, quiet, deliberate, searching for what I'd missed. Eventually, I found myself in Patrick's office again. The afternoon light was soft, falling across his old desk in strips that looked almost like bars. I opened the top drawer, not the one where I'd found the folder, but the smaller one where he kept his daily planner. The leather cover had worn smooth from years of use. Patrick's handwriting filled every page with neat, slanted letters, small notes, reminders, and the occasional doodle when his mind wandered. I turned the pages slowly, half expecting them to hum with the life that once filled the space between those lines. And then I saw it, a name circled twice in pencil. Hal Givens, Tuesday, 10 a.m. I frowned, trying to place it. I knew the name faintly, someone from a charity event years ago, maybe a tax consultant Patrick had mentioned once in passing. But why was Hal's name written down during the months Patrick was too ill to drive himself anywhere? I called Daniel immediately. He answered after one ring. "You found something, didn't you?" I told him about Hal. Daniel's tone shifted, sharper, focused. "I know that name. He handles financial reviews for nonprofits. He's solid. If Patrick met with him, it wasn't casual. I'll reach out, see what he remembers." The next few days dragged by in a fog of waiting. I went through my routines like a ghost. I still watered the plants, still brewed my tea at the same time every morning, but my thoughts were elsewhere, looping through possibilities, replaying Rebecca's voice at the will reading, the way she said my name without emotion. On Friday, Daniel called back. "Hal remembers him," he said without preamble. They met once, maybe 6 weeks before Patrick passed. Patrick looked unwell, thin, tired, but clear-headed. They talked about the trusts. He had questions about beneficiary clauses and survivor rights. Hal said he seemed uneasy but didn't elaborate. I gripped the phone tighter. Did he mention Rebecca? "Yes," Daniel replied quietly. "She canceled their next appointment, said Patrick no longer needed consultation." For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of my refrigerator in the background, ticking seconds into something heavier. Hal had offered to review the trust independently, but Patrick never followed through. Because she stopped him. Daniel promised to gather Hal's intake notes. He said they won't be legally binding, but they'll show intent, they'll show doubt, and that's enough to start an inquiry if we need it. When the call ended, I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the tie clip Rebecca had given me. I realized then it wasn't a keepsake, it was a distraction, something shiny to make me stop looking elsewhere. But I was looking now, and I wasn't about to stop, because Hal's notes weren't the only thing he'd kept, and what surfaced next would shatter Rebecca's carefully constructed story. The weekend felt unusually quiet, as if the air itself were holding its breath. I tried to distract myself with small chores, folding laundry, wiping down the counters, reorganizing the spice rack. But each task left my mind drifting back to Hal's meeting, to the unanswered questions Patrick had carried in those final weeks. My Sunday afternoon, I couldn't sit still anymore. I returned to the study, pulled open the calendar again, and traced Patrick's penciled circles with my fingertip. What had he been thinking that day? Why hadn't he told me about how? Why had he let Rebecca take the reins without a word? These thoughts kept looping in my mind until a new idea struck me. Patrick kept everything: old bills, drafts of letters, tax forms, filed neatly in a cabinet in the garage. I hadn't looked through it since the hospital days. Dust had settled over it, the metal cold and slightly rusted. When I slid the drawer open, the familiar scent of tobacco and cedar rose up, and for a moment, I felt him there with me. Inside were rows of folders labeled by year. I pulled out the most recent one, flipping through each paper, searching for something, anything, that might explain his hesitations. And then I found it. A document titled Revocable Living Trust Addendum. Unsigned, unfiled, unapproved. The draft language had been revised multiple times, different paragraphs crossed out, rewritten, circled, or marked with arrows. But what caught my breath was one section labeled Survivor Protections. My name appeared clearly in the initial draft, outlined with bullet points for health care, property security, long-term support. Patrick had scribbled a note beside it: discuss more safeguards with M. R says she'll finalize, not sure. R. Rebecca. My heart sank. Patrick had tried. He had been trying to protect me even when his strength was fading, but instead of finishing what mattered, he'd handed control to the one person who had the most to gain by cutting me out. I copied the draft and called Daniel. He answered immediately. I found something, I said. When I read the notes aloud, he let out a long exhale. Marin, this is huge. Bring it in tomorrow. Lydia needs to see this. After we hung up, I sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The evening breeze was cool, carrying the sharp scent of early winter. I watched leaves skitter across the driveway, heard the distant hum of a car passing, and let myself feel the weight of everything. It wasn't just grief anymore. It wasn't confusion. It was betrayal, quiet, deliberate, and calculated. Rebecca hadn't simply taken advantage of Patrick's trust. She had redirected his final choices. She had stepped into the space where I should have been standing and claimed authority he never fully gave her. Not willingly, anyway. That night, I slept lightly, waking at every sound, my mind lingering on each scribbled phrase Patrick left behind. The clues were scattered, but they were beginning to form a picture. A dark one. And the next morning, when Lydia reviewed the addendum, she confirmed what I feared most. This wasn't just unethical, it was intentional. Lydia was already in Daniel's office when I arrived the next morning. Sunlight filtered through the blinds in narrow stripes, casting patterns across stacks of folders and color-coded tabs spread across the conference table. She didn't greet me with pleasantries. She simply extended her hand for the draft I'd brought. Lydia read every line with a precision that reminded me of a surgeon inspecting an X-ray before an operation. Daniel stood behind her, arms folded, expression locked in quiet concentration. When she finally set the papers down, she tapped twice on the margin where Patrick had written, R says she'll finalize, not sure. This, she said, is the biggest crack in her version of events so far. My stomach tightened. What does that mean? It means, Lydia replied, choosing each word with care, this wasn't just Patrick being disorganized or forgetful. This note shows hesitation, doubt. He wasn't fully consenting to the changes Rebecca rushed through. She slid the addendum toward me again. And that makes everything she filed subject to scrutiny. Hearing it aloud brought a mixture of relief and dread. If Patrick had been coerced, pressured, or manipulated, it meant the truth was on my side. But it also meant he had lived his final weeks carrying more fear than he let me see. Lydia straightened her stack of papers. I'm filing a motion today, a temporary freeze on all estate transactions. If the judge approves, Rebecca won't be able to move a single asset without notification. It felt like a lifeline, one that wrapped around everything Rebecca had tried to claim. I nodded. Do it. Over the next hour, Lydia walked us through what would come next. Subpoenas, requests for metadata, a deep review of digital signatures, possible deposition of Rebecca's staff. She spoke with calm certainty. No theatrics, no dramatics, just facts, real steps, a plan. But the moment that stuck with me most came when she tapped the witness signatures. These two names, she said, have appeared in previous cases involving questionable notarizations. She lifted her eyes to mine. We're not just dealing with ambition here. This may be part of a larger pattern. A shiver moved through me. Daniel stepped closer. We're going to get answers, Marin. You're not doing this alone. For a moment, I had to look away. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to me like that, with steadiness instead of pity, clarity instead of condescension. When I left the office, the sky was gray and heavy, the kind of clouds that threaten rain but never quite commit. I walked slowly to my car, letting the wind cool the heat gathering in my chest. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my hands were steady. That evening, I opened a box of Patrick's old things, ticket stubs, postcards, a few photographs from vacations where we both looked sunburned and wildly alive. I studied the lines of his face, remembering how he used to say, "Truth has a way of outlasting everything else." I hoped he was right, because for the first time since he died, I felt like we were moving towards something undeniable. But only a day later, Lydia uncovered an email hidden deep in the probate filings, one that exposed Rebecca's intentions long before Patrick ever signed a single page. The next afternoon, Lydia called me with a strain in her voice I hadn't heard before. She asked me to come to her office as soon as possible. No explanation, no hint, just urgency. I drove there with a hollow feeling in my stomach, gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. When I stepped into the conference room, Lydia already had a printout placed neatly in the center of the table. Daniel stood beside her, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the document as if it were a live wire. "This came from the probate archive," Lydia said. "It wasn't part of the original packet. It was buried inside a supplemental record." I moved closer and the words hit me immediately. Subject: revised structure. Immediate action required. From Rebecca L. Date: 6 weeks before Patrick's passing. Marked confidential. My heart began to thrum in my chest as Lydia slid the paper toward me. The email was short, almost disarmingly so. Finalize redistribution. Remove discretionary clauses. All co-beneficiary privileges should be removed per discussion. Expedite witness processing. No delays. I read it twice, then a third time, each pass sinking deeper. My name wasn't mentioned explicitly, just co-beneficiary privileges, an antiseptic phrase that sanitized the brutality of erasing a wife from her own husband's legacy. Daniel exhaled slowly. This was sent before Patrick was hospitalized the final time, meaning Rebecca wasn't reacting to a crisis. She was planning something, strategically, quietly, early. Lydia pointed to the timestamp. This was sent at the same time Patrick's health began to decline sharply. And look at the recipient. I scanned the line. The email had been sent to 2 junior associates at her firm, neither of whom had appeared at the will reading. They were the ones who had filed the amendments, the ones who had acted on her instructions. She hadn't updated the will because Patrick asked. She had updated it because she believed she could get away with it. My chest tightened, anger swelling not like a sudden flame, but like a slow, controlled burn. Lydia sat beside me. This email alone won't prove coercion, but it proves intent, premeditation, and it contradicts her statement that Patrick initiated the changes. Daniel added, it shows she moved before he ever consented. A wave of heat washed over me, part betrayal, part vindication, part sorrow for the man who trusted someone who didn't deserve it. I want to move forward, I said quietly. Whatever comes next, I'm ready. Lydia nodded. Then we'll proceed to the preliminary hearing. This email changes everything. I left the office feeling both exhausted and sharpened, like someone stepping out of a fog and finally seeing the shape of the landscape ahead. The wind was cold, but it cleared my mind. At home, I placed the printed email on Patrick's desk. For a moment, I imagined him standing beside me, eyebrows raised, that half smile he used when he knew something wasn't right, but didn't yet know how to fix it. I'm fixing it, I whispered, and I meant it. But the fallout came sooner than expected, because the moment Rebecca discovered the inquiry had begun, she didn't stay quiet. She attacked back. The first sign of backlash came 3 days later. A thick envelope slipped under my front door, the edges still crisp from the printer. I didn't recognize the handwriting, but the return address told me everything I needed to know. Law offices of Greer and Fallon, counsel for Rebecca L. I carried it to the kitchen table, my hands steady but my breath uncomfortably shallow. Part of me already knew what it contained, but seeing the pages in black and white still made something in my chest twist. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a conversation. It was a warning. The letter accused me of purposely disrupting a lawful transition of estate authority. It claimed I was acting out of emotional distress, confusion, and grief-induced misinterpretation. They even suggested that my involvement could incur substantial financial liability if I refused to withdraw my challenge. In other words, shut up, step aside, accept the rewritten story. I set the letter down and stared at the kitchen window. Outside, the maple branches swayed calmly in the breeze, completely indifferent to the drama unfolding inside my home. I let out a slow breath that felt like it had been trapped for weeks. Then I dialed Daniel. He answered almost immediately. She moved, didn't she? Yes, I said. She wants me to withdraw. Daniel snorted, an uncharacteristic, dry, almost amused sound. Of course she does. That means the inquiry is hidden closer than she expected. Bring the letter to Lydia. We'll handle it. But what struck me most wasn't their confidence. It was the absence of panic in myself. A month ago, this letter would have shattered me. Now it only solidified my resolve. Patrick once told me, pressure reveals the truth in people. Rebecca was showing hers. That afternoon, I met with Lydia again. She skimmed the letter, then set it aside with a dismissive flick. Empty threats. If she truly believed her position was airtight, she wouldn't be trying to intimidate you out of the process. We'll issue a formal rebuttal. Relief washed through me, not because I wanted a fight, but because I was no longer standing alone. Over the next 2 hours, we assembled our response, citing inconsistencies in signature timestamps, highlighting unauthorized witnesses, referencing the concealed email, presenting Howe's notes, and flagging the drafted addendum Patrick never approved. When we finished, Lydia looked at me with unusual softness. You've done everything exactly right, and you've done it with grace most people couldn't maintain. I didn't feel graceful. I felt tired, but I nodded, grateful. That night, I sat on the porch, wrapped in a warm sweater, listening to the distant hum of cars passing on the street below. The world kept moving, indifferent to this quiet war. But inside me, something was shifting. Not rage, not vengeance, conviction. Rebecca wasn't protecting Patrick's legacy. She was protecting her own ambition. And ambition built on deceit eventually collapses. But I didn't expect the next collapse to come from inside her own camp, when someone from her office reached out with information she never meant to leak. The message arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning, subtle, almost timid, as if the sender feared being discovered the moment the notification appeared. I was wiping down the kitchen counter when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. "Hi, this is Ava. I work at Rebecca's firm. I need to talk to you." For a moment, I just stood there, the cloth still in my hand, the world narrowing into that single line of text. Ava. I remembered her vaguely, the polite assistant who had passed around forms during the estate meeting, eyes always down, posture rigid, trying to take up as little space as possible. I typed back, "Is everything okay?" A pause. Then, "Not really. I can't say much in writing. Can we meet? Please." She suggested a quiet coffee shop on the edge of Pound, somewhere public enough to feel safe, but not so busy that anyone from the firm might wander in. I agreed. The rain eased by the time I parked outside the cafe. Inside, Ava sat in the corner, shoulders hunched, hands wrapped tightly around a paper cup. She looked younger out of the office environment, more human, less polished. When I approached, she stood abruptly. "Mrs. Lowell, thank you for coming." "Please," I said softly. "Call me Marin." She nodded, as if the permission itself was a relief. We sat. A long silence followed, broken only by the soft clatter of dishes behind the counter. Then she inhaled, steadying herself. "I'm not supposed to be talking to you, but something isn't right. I've known for weeks." I kept my voice gentle. "Take your time." Ava looked down, fiddling with the cardboard sleeve around her cup. "I didn't understand everything at first. I'm not high level. I just witness documents sometimes, file things, stamp things. But the process around Patrick's revisions was not normal." "How so?" I asked quietly. She swallowed hard, then spoke faster. "Things were rushed. Meetings happened after hours. Rebecca told us to backdate some logs. Nothing obvious, just small clerical things, to make the timeline look clean. I didn't think about it until recently. But one thing I can't ignore." She reached into her bag and pulled out a notebook. Small, worn, edges frayed. She flipped it open to a page where she had scribbled something in blue ink. 7:43 p.m. Witnessed signature for R. No P present. P. Patrick. My breath caught. "You weren't there when he signed." Ava shook her head quickly. "No, he wasn't in the building. Rebecca said he had signed earlier and they just needed me to witness it for the packet. She said it was routine, but it didn't feel routine. Not at all." The weight of her confession settled over us both. She continued, quieter. "I didn't want to get involved. I have a child, a mortgage. But when I heard there was an inquiry, I realized staying silent made me complicit." My eyes softened. "Thank you, Ava, truly." She exhaled shakily like she'd been holding her breath for weeks. "I'll speak to your attorney. I'll tell the truth." As we stood to leave, she hesitated. "There's something else," she whispered. Something I heard Rebecca say the night those papers were finalized. I turned toward her fully. What did she say, Ava? Ava's voice dropped to a tremor. She said she needed everything done quickly, before you started asking questions. Lightning shot down my spine. And that wasn't even the worst of it, because Ava's testimony opened a door Rebecca never expected anyone to walk through. Ava's statement shifted everything. Lydia scheduled her deposition immediately. Quiet, confidential, handled with the kind of care that comes when truth is fragile and someone is risking everything to speak it aloud. The following Tuesday, I arrived early to Lydia's office. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and the sky was painted in muted shades of lavender and gray. Inside, the conference room lights glowed softly, illuminating neatly arranged documents and the small recorder waiting at the center of the table. Ava arrived right on time. Her hand shook slightly as she removed her coat, but when she sat down, a steadiness settled over her, like she had already made peace with whatever consequences her honesty might bring. Lydia began gently, guiding Ava through the timeline. Ava's voice quivered at first, but soon her words found rhythm. She described the night she'd been asked to witness a signature without Patrick being present. How the office was dark except for the conference room. How Rebecca had paced the length of the glass table, phone pressed to her ear, speaking in clipped instructions about ensuring swift completion and eliminating discretionary confusion. But what made Lydia pause, what made Daniel lean in, was what Ava described next. There was a moment, Ava whispered, twisting her hands together, when Rebecca thought I'd stepped out of the room. She said something to the staffer next to her, something that's been stuck in my head. Lydia nodded. Go on. Ava took a breath. She said, if we wait any longer, she will interfere, and we can't afford interference. The room went still. She? Daniel asked. She meant Marin? Yes, Ava said softly. Your name came up again 2 days later. She said, the window is closing. Finish what needs finishing before she catches on. A cold weight settled inside me. The words weren't vague. They weren't open to interpretation. They were intentional. They were strategic. They were about me. Ava continued. Rebecca was focused on speed more than procedure. She wanted the documents completed before anything interrupted her plan. She said Patrick was becoming inconsistent, sentimental, she called it. She worried he might change his mind. Lydia scribbled notes rapidly. And the signatures, Lydia asked. Ava nodded. 2 sets were collected on a Sunday night. The office was supposed to be closed. I asked if Patrick had come in at that hour. Rebecca said he'd signed earlier and they had forgotten to log it. She shook her head. But I saw the timestamp on the server. It didn't match their story. By the time Ava finished, her shoulders had slumped. Exhaustion etched into her expression. You've been incredibly brave, I told her. She blinked rapidly, eyes shining. I just want the truth out there. I don't want to be part of a lie. Lydia ended the deposition, thanked Ava formally, and promised her protection and anonymity as much as the law allowed. When Ava left the room, Daniel exhaled heavily. This is bigger than a dispute. This is deception, coordinated, planned. Lydia closed the folder with a soft snap. We can take this to the judge. We have more than suspicion now. We have witness testimony, inconsistencies, and documented intentions. I felt the weight of it all rise and settle inside me. For the first time, not as grief, but as purpose. And just as we prepared to file our next motion, Rebecca made one final attempt to stop me, an attempt that revealed just how afraid she really was. The days that followed Ava's deposition were strangely still. It was the kind of quiet that comes before a storm, deceptive, heavy, watchful. Lydia warned me that when people like Rebecca feel something slipping from their grasp, they don't admit defeat. They maneuver. They strike. They manipulate the narrative before anyone else can. I didn't have to wait long to see it. 3 days later, another envelope arrived, this one delivered by courier. The knock on my door sounded polite but firm, like the kind that precedes unwelcome news. The courier handed me the envelope with a professional smile, unaware of the weight he'd just delivered. My name was typed neatly across the front. Inside was a letter, not from her attorney this time, but from Rebecca herself. Her handwriting was sharp, deliberate, almost too controlled. I recognized the style. She always wrote like someone performing competence, each letter perfectly shaped, nothing crossing the lines. The letter was short. Marin, I'm asking you to stop this. This process is damaging the foundation and it is tarnishing what Patrick wanted. Whatever misunderstandings exist, we can resolve them privately if you withdraw your claims immediately. Please consider the legacy you're jeopardizing. Rebecca. No apology, no acknowledgement. Just pressure wrapped in manufactured civility. I sat back in my chair, the paper trembling slightly in my hands, not from fear but from something sharper, something like indignation finally finding its voice. Patrick's legacy wasn't a chess piece she could hold hostage, and the fact that she was now addressing me directly, bypassing her lawyers, told me everything I needed to know. She was worried. Deeply. I read the letter again, slower this time, analyzing the spaces between her carefully chosen words. The crifts showed themselves easily now. Misunderstandings. Privately. Jeopardizing. She was trying to contain the fallout, trying to keep the truth from spilling into rooms where she couldn't control the narrative. A few hours later, I met with Lydia and handed her the letter. She skimmed it, then looked up at me with a wry smile. She's panicking. Daniel chuckled under his breath. Finally. But Lydia shook her head. This isn't a peace offering. It's a last-ditch attempt to intimidate you with guilt. She folded the letter carefully. Don't respond. Not personally. We'll file our motion and let the court speak. The hearing was now days away, a short preliminary session where the judge would decide whether to open full discovery. Based on everything we had gathered, Ava's testimony, the concealed email, the mismatched timestamps, and the unsigned addendum, Lydia felt confident. She expects you to crumble, Lydia told me gently, but you've done nothing wrong. You're protecting what Patrick intended. That night, I lit a candle in the living room and sat quietly, letting the warm glow fill the space. For the first time since Patrick's death, I felt him near. Not as an ache, but as a kind of steady presence. I whispered into the quiet, I'm not backing down. And I meant every word, because on the day of the hearing, something happened in that courtroom that none of us, especially Rebecca, saw coming. The courthouse felt colder than I expected. Sterile hallways, polished floors, and the crisp echo of every step that landed just a bit too loudly. I arrived early with Lydia and Daniel, my palms damp despite the winter chill that clung to the air. This was only a preliminary hearing, a procedural step, but it felt like everything had been building toward this moment. Inside the courtroom, the seating was sparse. A few clerks shuffled papers, a bailiff stood at rigid attention, and the judge reviewed his docket with a kind of weary patience. Rebecca was already there, seated beside her attorneys, perfectly composed in a charcoal gray suit.
She didn't look at me, not even once, but her jaw was tight, her hands clasped just a breath too firmly. When the judge called our case, the room settled into silence. Lydia rose first, presenting our request. The inconsistencies in signature logs, the concealed emails suggesting premeditated alterations, the draft addendum Patrick never signed, the questionable witness procedures, and finally, Ava's sworn testimony. Her delivery wasn't dramatic, it was controlled, methodical, each point stacking on top of the last until the weight of it became impossible to ignore. Rebecca's attorney countered, insisting the inquiry was unnecessary, claiming emotional instability on my part, arguing that the estate process had been followed to the letter. He spoke confidently, but every time he mentioned Patrick's clear wishes, my chest tightened with something between grief and fury. Then the judge asked a single question that shifted the entire energy of the room. "Counselor," he said, addressing Rebecca's side, "can you explain why a key email was omitted from the probate packet when it clearly pertains to the trust revisions?" The attorney hesitated. Rebecca's gaze flicked sharply toward him, then away. Lydia stepped forward. "Your Honor, we have reason to believe its omission was intentional." I could feel the tension ripple across the table where Rebecca sat. The judge leaned back, studying us all with the kind of muted intensity that comes from seeing too many lies dressed as legal arguments. He cleared his throat. "I find there is sufficient concern regarding the authenticity and integrity of the filed documents. As such, I am granting the motion for full discovery. All materials, including electronic logs, internal communications, witness statements, and drafting records, will be reviewed in detail." Rebecca's composure cracked, just barely, but enough to reveal a flicker of panic in her eyes. Her attorney objected, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. "This is not a determination of guilt. It is a determination that further examination is warranted. The court aims to honor the intent of the deceased and to ensure no party is deprived of rightful consideration." My breath trembled on its way out. Relief washed through me, not as triumph, but something steadier, something like justice beginning to stir. As we exited the courtroom, Daniel gripped my shoulder. "This is the beginning of the truth coming out, and she knows it." Lydia nodded, her calm unwavering. "We move forward, and we do it on solid ground." Outside, the winter sun broke through a cluster of clouds, casting a pale but unmistakable light across the courthouse steps. I closed my eyes, letting it warm my face. For the first time in months, the heaviness in my chest eased, replaced by something faint but undeniable. Hope. Not naive hope, earned hope. I whispered to the wind, "Patrick, I'm still here, I'm still fighting," and I felt, however faintly, that he heard me, because even though the hearing had ended, the unraveling of Rebecca's story was only beginning, and the truth was finally moving in our directions.